surrounded by so many people with open minds and open hearts, people who are willing to imagine that there is more to this world than meets our own eyes. And I want to share with you how my own eyes have been opened and how I have learned to care more about a group of people we're supposed to despise, people we're supposed to hate, people we're supposed to fear, people we are taught are unworthy, fundamentally unworthy of our care, compassion, and concern. I'm here to talk about criminals, and I'm here to talk about our criminal justice system, a system of mass incarceration, a penal system unprecedented in world history. Millions of people are locked up in the United States today. Overwhelmingly poor people and people of color, locked in literal cages, often treated worse than animals, and then upon their release, they're stripped of the basic civil and human rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement, like the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, and the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, access to education, and basic public benefits. So many of the old forms of discrimination that we supposedly left behind during the Jim Crow era are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. That's why I now believe we have not truly ended racial caste in America. We've merely redesigned it. Now, I want to just admit at the outset that there was a time when I rejected this kind of talk out of hand. There was a time when I rejected comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery or mass incarceration and Jim Crow, and believed that people who made those kinds of claims and those kinds of comparisons were actually doing more harm than good to efforts to reform our criminal justice system or achieve greater racial equality in the United States. In fact, the first time I encountered the idea that our criminal justice system might be functioning like a caste system, I was living in Oakland, California, and I was rushing to catch the bus. And as I was hurrying down the street, there was this bright orange poster stapled to a telephone pole that caught my eye. And on it, it said in large bold print, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And I paused for a minute and scanned the text of the flyer, and I saw that some radical community group was holding a meeting several blocks away, and they were organizing to protest the new 3 strikes law in California, the expansion of this prison system, the drug war, racial profiling, police brutality. The list went on, and I stood there looking at the flyer thinking to myself, yeah, our criminal justice system may be biased in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons to Jim Crow. People just think you're crazy. And then I crossed the street, hopped on the bus, headed to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU. Well, when I joined the ACLU, I assumed that our criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, much in the same way that all institutions in our society are infected to some degree or another with problems associated with conscious or unconscious bias and stereotyping. And so I assumed that it was my job to join together with other advocates to try to root out racial bias wherever and whenever it might rear its ugly head in the criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to realize that I was just dead wrong about our criminal justice system. It's not just another institution in our society infected with some degree of bias, but a different beast entirely. The activists that posted that sign on the telephone pole weren't crazy. nor were the smattering of lawyers and activists around the country that were beginning to connect the dots between mass incarceration and earlier forms of racial and social control. Quite belatedly, I came to see that our criminal justice system now does function much more like a system of racial and social control than a system of crime prevention and control. Millions of children in the United States today grow up believing that they too one day will go to jail. In our most segregated, ghettoized communities in the United States, young people are shuttled from decrepit, underfunded schools to these brand new high-tech prisons. They're targeted at young ages, often before they're old enough to vote, stopped, frisked, searched, interrogated about who they are, where they're going if they are headed home with nothing but Skittles in their hand. Stop, frisk, search. And when they're arrested, they're typically arrested for a relatively minor, non-violent, often drug-related offense, the very sorts of crimes that occur with roughly equal frequency in middle-class white communities or on college campuses, but go largely ignored. They're arrested, swept in, branded criminals and felons, and then ushered into a permanent second-class status, a status from which they will never escape. And this is happening to people by the millions in this country. Today, there are more African American adults under correctional control, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. As of 2004, more black men were denied the right to vote than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, felon disenfranchisement laws in many states now accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. Now, this isn't a phenomenon that just affects some small segment of the African American community. To the contrary, in many large urban areas today, more than half of working age African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I find that these days, when I tell people that I now believe that our system of mass incarceration is like a new Jim Crow, a new caste-like system, people typically react with shocked disbelief. They say, how can you say that? How can you say that? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. And if black folks would stop running around committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being locked up and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights. But therein lies the greatest myth about mass incarceration, namely that it's been driven simply by crime and crime rates. It's not true. It's just not true. During a 30-year period of time, our nation's prison population quintupled. Not doubled or tripled, quintupled. We went from having a prison population in the 1970s of about 300,000 people. Today, we have an incarcerated population of over 2 million. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of even highly repressive regimes like Russia or China or Iran. But during this 30-year period of time when our prison population exploded, crime rates fluctuated. They went up, went down, went back up again, went down again, went up, and then down, down, down. And today, as bad as crime rates are in some parts of the country, crime rates nationally are at historical lows. But incarceration rates have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially Black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime is going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what explains this sudden, unprecedented explosion in incarceration, if not simply crime and crime rates? Well, it turns out that the activists who posted that sign on the telephone pole were right. The war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States on the heels of the civil rights movement. Drug convictions alone, just drug convictions, accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison population and more than half of the increase in the state prison population between 1985 and 2000, the period of our prison system's most dramatic expansion. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. I mean, to get a sense of how large a contribution the drug war has made to mass incarceration, think of it this way. There are more people in prisons and jails today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. You don't have to raise your hand. Most do. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. Even though studies have now consistently shown for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, this drug war has been waged almost exclusively on Black and brown communities. In fact, where significant differences in the data can be found, it frequently suggests that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug use, drug abuse, and drug dealing than Black youth. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with Black and brown drug offenders. Human Rights Watch reported at the peak of the drug war that in some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison were one race, African American. Now, I find that many people, when they see this data, they say, oh, that's a shame, that's a shame. But, we need a war on them in the hood. Because that's where the violent offenders can be found. That's where the drug kingpins can be found. But what many people don't realize is this drug war has never been focused primarily on rooting out the violent offenders or the drug kingpins. Federal funding in this war has flowed to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost the sheer numbers of drug arrests. It's been a numbers game. Law enforcement agencies have been rewarded in cash by the millions for the sheer numbers of people swept in for drug offenses, virtually guaranteeing that law enforcement goes out looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching as many people as possible to get their numbers up. And federal drug forfeiture laws allow state and local law enforcement agencies to keep for their own use up to 80% of the cash, cars, homes seized from suspected drug offenders. You don't have to be convicted, just suspected of a drug offense. And law enforcement can seize the cash out of your pocket, out of your home, take your car, sell it, keep the proceeds, thus giving law enforcement a direct monetary interest, not in ending drug abuse or drug addiction or drug-related harm, but in the longevity of this war itself. And the U.S. Supreme Court, far from resisting the rise of mass incarceration and the targeting of poor communities of color, far from resisting it, it has facilitated the drug war at every turn. The U.S. Supreme Court has eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, giving the police license to stop, frisk, search just about anyone, anywhere, without a shred of evidence of any criminal activity, as long as they get consent, which is really just compliance. And for those who want to challenge the bias that is on full display in the drug war, the U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors. The cases that I was bringing challenging patterns and practices of profiling by the police can't even be filed in a court of law today. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled explicitly that it does not matter how overwhelming your statistical evidence is. It does not matter how severe the racial disparities are. Unless you have proof of conscious intentional bias, tantamount to an admission by a law enforcement official of bias, you can't even state a claim for race discrimination in the criminal justice system today. In this way, the U.S. Supreme Court has effectively immunized the system of mass incarceration from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that it once rallied to the defense of slavery and Jim Crow in their days. But of course, being swept into this system at a young age with little hope of challenging the tactics or the bias that got you there is just the beginning of the odyssey for so many. Because once you're swept in, you're ushered into a parallel social universe in which the basic civil and human rights that apply to others no longer apply to you. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box on employment applications asking the dreaded question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Doesn't matter how long ago that felony may have occurred, months ago, weeks ago, or 35 years ago. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box, knowing full well your application's going straight to the trash. Housing discrimination, perfectly legal by public landlords and private housing landlords and officials. Public benefits are off limits to people who have been convicted of felonies, like food stamps. Under federal law, you can't even get food stamps if you've been convicted of a felony. What are people released from prison supposed to do? Can't get a job, barred from public housing, private housing, even food stamps may be off limits to you? Well, apparently what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. And paying back all these fees, fines, and court costs can be a condition of your probation or parole. And then get this, if you're one of the lucky few who actually manages to get a job following release from prison, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, and accumulated back child support. What do we expect folks released from prison to do? I say when we take a step back and view this system as a whole, how it operates practically from cradle to grave in some communities, you have to ask yourself, what does it seem designed to do? It seems designed, in my view, to keep sending folks right back to prison. And that is what, in fact, happens the vast majority of times. About 70% of people released from prison nationwide return within a few years, and the majority of those who return in some states do so in a matter of months because the challenges of mere survival on the outside are so immense. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in the United States. And if you imagine that surely something less could do, somehow we could tinker with this machine and get it right, consider the sheer scale of this system. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would need to find a new line of work. Private prison companies now listed on the New York Stock Exchange in doing quite well even during times of economic recession, those companies would be forced into bankruptcy. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure, it's not going to just fade away or downsize out of sight without a major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Now, I know that there's many people today who will say, well, there's just no hope of ending mass incarceration in America. Just as many people were resigned to the old Jim Crow in the South would say, oh, yeah, it's a shame, but that's just the way that it is. I find that so many people of all colors view the millions cycling in and out of our prisons and jails as just an unfortunate but basically inalterable fact of American life. Well, I am confident that Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and Ella Baker and Ann Braden and all those young people who risked their lives getting on buses and taking freedom rides through the South to end the old Jim Crow, they would not be so easily deterred. So I believe we have got to pick up where they left off and do the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors. In 1968, Dr. King told advocates that the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Meaningful equality, he said, could not be achieved through civil rights alone. Without basic human rights, the right to work, the right to a quality education, the right to housing, without basic human rights, he said, civil rights are an empty promise. So in honor of Dr. King and all those who labored to end earlier systems of racial or social control, I hope we will commit ourselves to building a human rights movement to end mass incarceration, a movement for education, not incarceration, a movement for jobs, not jails, and a movement to end all those forms of legal discrimination against people released from prison, discrimination denying them basic human rights to work, to shelter, and to food. But before this movement can truly get underway, a great awakening is required. We've got to awaken from this colorblind slumber we've been in to the realities of race in America. And we've got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals, not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has been the sturdy foundation for every caste-like system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of creating caste-like systems in America. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you.
So everybody to this first series, Imagining Justice. My name is Julia Dudley Najieb. I'm here with the wonderful, the one and only, as I know it, Reverend Jack Elliott. So, Imagining Justice, this was your whole idea. And if we can talk, or you can bring us up to speed.
What I want to do, and one of the things, a number of people have been coming to me and talking about in a time like this, what is ours to do? And one of the things that I want people to remember is, in some ways, there's nothing new about a time like this. But
it seems like it.
It seems like it, but you've heard that adage of, what lessons you don't learn from history, you're deemed to repeat.
Okay.
And what I believe is that we are really going through a collective time right now where some of the things we should have learned are coming up again for healing, for forgiving, and for discernment of how did it get to be this way.
So translation, slapped in the face again, and maybe we get it.
Hopefully we get it. Hopefully
that was my
intention is to get it this time. But it is...
We shouldn't have to get slapped in the face, by the way. No violence.
No violence, no. But it's approaching it with an attitude to understand.
Okay.
Rather than an attitude to correct, make wrong, or to blame. And a part of that doesn't say that work can't come into that. But if you think about that approach, and I'm sure a lot of us are having the same conversations around the Thanksgiving Day table or some other holiday table where there's that aunt or uncle that just, don't talk about this.
And that time is coming. November is coming very soon.
Right. And the truth is, we got to talk about it. And we've got to approach it in a different way, so that there can actually be a conversation.
You talked about imagining justice, though, and you talked about a world that works for everyone. So many times you've had the talks with us and trying to explain to us, well, what is that works for everyone? What is peace? And then you got all these different definitions. So how do you imagine justice without there being all these different definitions?
Well, it would be to accept there will be all kinds of different definitions.
Okay. That's difficult,
It is difficult, but let me give you a metaphor of something that might make it work for you. So many times we think about in society that if I accept your point of view, or if I understand a little bit more about you, then it's a melting pot. What it is really a tapestry, like a stained glass window or a quilt. And you might look at an individual's experience or one panel of the quilt, and it's quite beautiful. And you might put it right next to somebody else's panel and think, that doesn't go together.
Right.
These colors here are no way going to go with those colors there. But if you back yourself up enough, it's not any different than this background that's on our wall behind us.
A lot of colors.
There's a lot of colors there.
Yes.
And you can see a different picture than you might have seen if you were only focusing on the one color that's right there. Now, your world is this color that's right here.
Right.
And so you know everything about that particular color. And one of the things that we're taught as a child is, okay, if it's not yellow, you don't talk to them. You don't talk to them. They are the other. Now, I've often said that's within our DNA. That goes all the way back to a period in time when the first man saw another man. His first thought wasn't, oh, good, someone else.
Well, it should have been.
No,
Especially
it
if
was,
they're the only one.
are you going to eat me or am I going to eat you?
But have you seen the movie Castaway? He was so excited that the Wilson, the ball. It seems like human nature would say.
But that gets into our desire,
what
I believe spiritually, of what we came here to do. We operate on two different egos, or two different spheres in a sense. Our ego is what has always protected us. And so that ego that kicked into that first man who saw the other man had to assume that anything that he had experienced before was something that was going to eat him. So why are you different from that? So therefore, I have to size that up. I have to kind of decide that you're an ally. And once I decide that you're an ally, then I start to get the gift of being in relationship with other human beings. And I get to really realize that the one thing that differentiates us from anything else on the planet is our relationships. And so it's almost like, okay, we came here to learn about this stuff.
We're not doing a good job. If I look around the world, I'm just looking at the evidence of what I see today. And people think that, well, you know, we've come so far. We look at the civil rights movement and we've come so far. We had a black president. People always tell me that. So there's been a lot of progress, one would say. But in my community and other communities, people say, no, there hasn't. We have a lot of work to do.
Two things happen there. One, it's one of the things that happened is like, oh, yes, we did diversity last year.
Yes, last year.
So we don't have to do it again.
Oh, okay.
You know, we did that then. But the other thing that happens with that is we have to get into what we have been taught about privilege. And one of the things that you can use as an example, and often this is tested out, is what is normal.
Okay.
Well, normal is what looks like me.
So give me an example. Give me some normal things.
Well, if you look at why do we even have the definition of people of color?
You know, and we didn't make that term up, just to let you know.
No, but we use it, we embrace it as people.
Yeah.
So that in itself implies that, well, there's a normal and then there's people of color.
You're right.
So if there is a normal and there are people of color, then normal must be people without color.
And you brought up an interesting point, because when I was a little girl and I just knew I was in this group, this people of color group, automatically you just feel alienated. You don't even know why. Right. And that's magically with discrimination has been put on you, and yet you don't even realize it.
And if you look at how we move into the world, now, there was many from that great generation that kept saying this pronouncement, we are the greatest country in the world. How do other countries feel when they hear us say that? You know, and other countries are really not waiting for us to come rescue them. In fact, many countries are doing just fine. And they're really taken back about our egotistical idea that we're here to rescue. Same thing was done with the early missionaries that traveled to Africa.
Yes.
You know, there was an idea that something there needed to be healed, void of doing any research to ever understand how rich, how diverse, how highly educated, what systems of government was already in place. There was just this decision that, well, it must not be valid because you don't look like me. You know, we did it here in our own land, in our own country. We do it every Sunday in two very distinct places. We do it in our churches, and we do it in our sports arena.
But then again, we don't realize we're doing that.
No, we just buy into it, and we just repeat what it is that we've been taught.
How does one break a chain if they don't even know that they're in that?
One, you have to recognize the change, and you have to have discussions like this to kind of go like, okay, tell me why you're a Raiders fan. Well, my family has always been a Raiders fan.
From the Bay Area.
From the Bay Area.
Yeah, I get all these.
But what about when they went to L.A.?
Oh, yeah. We disowned
Well, they
them.
shouldn't have done that.
Yes.
We don't talk about that
That's
anymore.
right.
That's, that was like the divorce in the family.
That's right.
How do you feel about them going to Las Vegas next year?
I didn't feel good about that at all.
We're not going to talk about that any more than we're going to talk about the Warriors moving to San Francisco.
People get very, very touchy when you talk about their teams.
That's right. And see, but here right now, we have to get touchy.
Yeah.
We have to get touchy in the sense to understand that when I ask you how you come up with that decision, that it's not about making you wrong about that decision. If you came back to me and said, I love the Oakland Raiders because of the philanthropic work that they do in their community. Do you realize that the Oakland Raiders have raised more than $10.5 million for this cause or that cause that made a difference? Then I would go, oh, that's great. I'd be behind that team too. But instead, often the discourse looks like, well, what, are you a Niner fan? And so we kind of get into the discussion of what separates us rather than expanding the conversation to include what we can agree on.
I think one major factor, though, with that is because people work. they've got kids, they've got Little League, they've got whatever they got to do, and they're too busy to look up information about whatever football team has donated what. They really don't care. Or maybe they would care, like what you're saying.
Right.
But at that moment, they've got to cook dinner. They've got other things to do. They got to run and pick up Susie, who's been waiting outside the soccer field for about an hour.
Well, what I want to support them in understanding is taking accountability for the T-shirts they put on their kids when they go to school in the morning.
Okay.
If you're wearing the Nike swatch, you're saying, I belong to the Nike tribe. And I support everything about the Nike tribe. Well, again, if your decision has come through discernment and you like how they stand in the world and who they support in the world, then you got a story. But if you're only wearing the Nike swatch because you want to be a part of the group at school that's also wearing that,
Which is most likely the reason why.
then there's an opportunity for education to say, okay, are you really blending in? And I remember that when I first moved to San Francisco, I went into a club and a friend of mine looked at me and said, you are the only man in here that doesn't have a mustache.
Wow.
And I looked around.
And how did you feel when he said that?
I felt
You feel alienated?
My first response was just like, oh crap, I won't fit in. You know, and then I looked and I saw everyone had on a lacrosse polo shirt, 501 Levi jeans, a military belt, and a mustache.
Wow, you were totally out of sync. You just were not with the crowd.
And it was like, there I stood in my little sweater vest and going, ooh, this is not my tribe.
Yeah.
This is not
See,
my
but at least you
tribe.
recognize it. Other people would want to fit in.
Other people, yes, would have immediately ran out and bought something
Yeah.
to be able to get in.
Fake mustache and
But
everything.
what we have to encourage, especially the children, is their individuality. And that their individuality, if they trust that process, they will find a larger group that looks more like that tapestry. And so that if you look at who you draw to you and who you have in your life, you know, oftentimes, you know, and I don't want to suggest that this experience might have happened to you.
Okay.
But do you know my black friend that lives in Chicago?
Which one?
Exactly.
That's what I always say.
You know,
I always
but it
tell
was
people
like,
that.
You know, they're for the ignorant. There's this assumption that
I'm gonna
any
know all.
tribe has the phone list and the contact list for everybody else in that tribe.
Right.
And so therefore you must know her in Chicago because you're both black and you're both professional.
Yes, I've been told I'm also from West Africa, so.
Right. Well, and that's one of the other things that I find amazing is if you look at this whole thing that's going on now with Ancestry.com and with 123, I think the other product that is out there, there is something within us all that really want to know who we are and where we come from. And some of those folks and some of those studies are amazed to find out that they are not who they thought they are. You know, that they have to understand that you wouldn't be here if the first person wasn't on the continent of Africa.
So isn't there a great irony there? I'm just saying, just what if you had some of those groups that are considered racist, and we know who they are, they just happen to find out that they have, I don't know, 60% West African or whatever lineage. And
Right.
Oh, right back at you. Booyah. So I just think that would be the greatest irony.
Right. And I think, you know, it will come, you know, where technology over the next years will serve us in that way, in the sense that you won't necessarily have to send off for the kid in the same way that we do. It might happen just as when we go to the DMV, but I think the discourse that we're going through now is getting us ready for that time. You know, where we have that understanding of, oh, who are you? You know, and it's like a part of what I know even in my own history. I was always taught that I was 1/16 Native American. Well, what I really understood after I did my own research is that I'm actually 1/16 Filipino American. But the people in the Midwest had never seen a Filipino.
So they wouldn't know what
So
to
they
call.
just assumed she was different, so therefore she must be Native American.
Oh.
And so that history gets passed on and passed on and passed on. And I have also met folks, one of the things that when I did my research and the great shame about, working that history out, my family settled through New Bern, North Carolina. And New Bern, North Carolina is named after Bern, Switzerland.
Bern, Switzerland.
Because people from Switzerland came and they came into that port and decided we're going to make a little Switzerland right here in North Carolina. We'll call it New Bern. And so my great-great-great-grandfather was a shipmaster and would bring slaves from Ireland to the United States on his ship. He made 17 passages from Europe to New Bern, North Carolina, with 200 people on that ship.
Who's writing all this stuff down? How did you get this information?
It's written down.
Okay.
If you go to
Somebody
New Bern,
wrote it
that
down.
history is there.
Okay.
And one day, the ship pulls in, and another ship is beside of him, and as the people get off, the other ship is from Africa. 300 people get off the ship from Africa, but 200 people get off of the ship from Europe. And he says to the shipmaster, I don't understand. We have the same size ships, but you get 100 more people. I don't understand how you get 100 more people and still have room for the food to feed them and the provisions to get them here. And that shipmaster said, you feed them? Because he had made the decision that the strongest from Africa would survive the trip without food. And therefore, when they went to be sold, that they would have a higher value and he would get a higher return on his money.
Wow.
So for the next 3 passages that my great-great-great-grandfather made, he had 300 people on his ship.
And they didn't get fed.
And they didn't get fed.
Okay.
Because the distance was the same across the Atlantic Ocean. It was just from a different angle. Now, what happened once that they settled, this was actually during the time of King George's reign. So the United States really wasn't even the United States at that period of time. But the people that came from Europe, we have heard the term free white and 21. Well, what that meant is they were only slaves until they turned 21. And so the agreement with Europe was once they turned 21, they had to be freed. Well, where did they go? They're all still there together. And who did they identify with? Well, who they most identified with were the folks that had come from Africa, so kinships were made. Relationships were formed.
Right.
And who was also watching was the Native Americans that the land in North Carolina had been taken from. So the Native Americans were rushing out to help the African Americans and helping the Irish in it. And they eventually killed my grandfather. He was killed in an Indian uprising when they were trying to take it back. But those folks intermarried.
Don't worry, it's a train.
Yeah, my train is. They intermarried. Many of those African Americans that people in North Carolina would drive by and go, oh, you're an African American. No, I'm not. I'm Native American. And yes, they are. But no, you're mistaken. You're not. Because you have this skin color, you're not Native American. But both of your parents may very well have been. And their parents, we don't know. But nevertheless, there's this whole thing of, I got to separate you. I've got to separate you. I've got to keep you separate.
You're right, and that's very frustrating. Even I see in our community between people that want to be called black and people that want to be referred to as African American. You have a large movement that's going on where people don't want to be considered African American because they say their ancestors didn't come from Africa.
Right.
There's actually proof of that, and I understand it because even looking at my family, it's mostly Native American. if you look at
Right.
the background. And there's this huge movement. I know maybe from the outside, people don't know that that's what's happening, but they would just rather be called black because we're such a melting pot of so many other cultures. There's also the reality that slave masters did rape women. So we have a mixture of everything. Those are just the facts the way they are.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to own that history too. You know, if you go to Monticello right now, just for the first time, hundreds of years later, they're finally telling the truth
Right.
about the children that were actually
And they
born
kept
there.
that hidden for a long time.
Right. And it's like
As if it were urban legend almost to that point, and had people believing they were crazy when they would find out the history. Oh, no, that didn't happen. Well, where'd you hear that?
well, if you look at it now, if you look at Donna Brazil's new book, you know, Colored Girls in Politics.
Yes.
You know, they're one of the things that happened, it gets a little bit back to that, oh, we did that last year kind of thing. But it was the story of these remarkable women that have so much to offer to the political process, but they're being shunned because we did that before. You know, we did President Obama, so therefore we don't really have to do that right now. We need to do something different. And, you know, what that is saying to so many people is if I witness you being marginalized, then I fear my own marginalization. And because I cannot, what we teach in our philosophy, I cannot say in you what I don't believe to be true for me. So I will deny that you are being marginalized because I don't want to be marginalized. And so therefore, I am going to move about my life on a subconscious level, making sure that I'm not marginalized. I'm going to wear the Nike Swatch if I need to be in the right group. I'm going to go to the right university if I need to the right prep school. You know, a lot of people even look in something as simple in our own community. When I first moved to Fresno, the only thing that people would say to me when I first moved here is, now you moved north of Shaw, right? I didn't know.
And I've never heard that when I moved to Fresno.
Right.
So that's what's ironic.
Because they don't want you to be north
Yeah,
of Shaw.
they don't want me north of Shaw. But that's the reality.
That's the reality.
Let's talk about that. After the break, I want to get into that part because you've said that a couple times during talks, and I noticed we were never told that, and a number of African Americans that moved here were never ever told that.
Right.
Let's talk about that.
All right.
Those of you who are tuned in, you're watching Imagining Justice, Part 1. Myself, Julia Dudley Najieb, along with Reverend Jack Elliott. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Can I recycle this?
When it comes to recycling, don't get hosed. Put broken garden hoses in the gray trash cart. For more recycling do's and don'ts, ask us on our Instagram or visit keepfresnoclean.com.
This is important news for people who have been exposed to the weed killer Roundup in commercial settings and later developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. According to the World Health Organization's research on cancer, the active ingredient in the weed killer Roundup, glyphosate, can cause cancers such as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. If you or a loved one were exposed to Roundup in a commercial setting such as farming, landscaping, or golf course maintenance, and then developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you could be eligible for a cash award and medical expenses. If you or a loved one were exposed to the weed killer Roundup and were then diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, call the law offices of Davis and Crump right now to see if you are eligible for a cash award and medical expenses. Our first consultation is free, and we don't get paid unless you get paid. Call now. Operators are standing by.
Attention all timeshare owners. Were you a victim of a high-pressure or dishonest timeshare sales agent? Were you misled and confused by what you were buying? Did the timeshare fail to deliver what you were promised? Do you feel that you overpaid and just want out? If you answered yes to any of these questions, we can help. We're Timeshare Compliance, and every day we help hundreds of timeshare victims protect their rights, and we can help you too. Our team can legally terminate your timeshare agreement, ending the payments forever, saving you thousands. But you must act now. Call now for a free consultation. With one simple call, the professionals at Timeshare Compliance can legally terminate your timeshare agreement and help end your financial suffering. You could save thousands. So call now before another payment is due. Timeshare Compliance is A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau. Don't wait.
Call 800-455-0830. 800-455-0830.
Attention all timeshare owners. Were you a victim of a high-pressure or dishonest timeshare sales agent? Were you misled and confused by what you were buying? Did the timeshare fail to deliver what you were promised? Do you feel that you overpaid and just want out? If you answered yes to any of these questions, we can help. We're Timeshare Compliance, and every day we help hundreds of timeshare victims protect their rights, and we can help you too. Our team can legally terminate your timeshare agreement, ending the payments forever, saving you thousands. But you must act now. Call now for a free consultation. With one simple call, the professionals at Timeshare Compliance can legally terminate your timeshare agreement and help end your financial suffering. You could save thousands. So call now before another payment is due. Timeshare Compliance is A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau. Don't wait.
Call 800-455-0830. 800-455-0830.
What cart does this go in?
We know changing diapers stinks, Andy, but what you do with that doo-doo is throw it in the gray cart. To learn more about recycling do's and don'ts, ask us on our Instagram or visit keepfresnoclean.com.
With an Imagining Justice series, Reverend Jack Elliott, who has been helping us to understand, I think, both sides, because I'm realizing that I'm African American, I'm black, or I'm black, I'm African American. I'm realizing that I didn't get to move, or nobody told me to move like north of Shaw, right?
Right.
So those, but it's a lot deeper than that. We're looking at how all of these ideas connect. And eventually, we're going to be really getting into how this all connects with the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book, which is one of the reasons why the Imagining Justice series was brought together. But we wanted to have this beginning intro with myself and Reverend Jack to really talk about how much bias is really all throughout our lives, and also helps us understand the problems that we're having today in politics. So Reverend Jack, you're breaking it down.
Right, because a part of it, if you think about it, if you look at CCNRs from neighborhoods that were built, oftentimes, like if you looked at any development here in Fresno that might have been built in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, they would have within that CCNR who you could sell your house to and who you could not. You know, oftentimes we hear about after World War II, Levittown in Pennsylvania and Levittown, New York, you know, were communities that were built to honor the veterans. Honor those vets, give them a home. And we praised them and praised them and praised them, but they were only houses for white people. And that was a restriction that was understood, but not spoken of. And so much about the whole original Jim Crow was these agreements that we have in society. We wouldn't be stupid enough to make it a law, but there are agreements that we make that banks are only going to give black folks loans to buy houses in areas that nobody else would buy. You would be redlined. You would not have an opportunity to buy a home north of Shaw. And that was just kind of that little nod as to why that would be. You know, and then we got a little bit more sophisticated. And, you know, in the 80s and 90s, the jargon...
And these were laws, by the way. These were Jim Crow was actually a law when we're looking at how
Yes, but a lot of the tenets of Jim Crow weren't laws.
Okay, gotcha.
They were agreements that were just implied.
Okay.
You know, because they didn't want to make it a law. You know, if you look, you know, systems such as, you know, the Freemasons.
Okay.
Okay. A black person couldn't be in the Masonic Lodge. So they created their own Masonic Lodge. And there was all that whole thing that after a period of time, what do you mean we're not the same lodge? And it's like, well, okay, I guess we should be, you know, but it was really set up not to be. And, you know, the whole marketing behind the separate entrance in a theater for colored folks. There would be a marketing campaign for colored folks, come into the air conditioning, get out of the heat. Well, okay, I'll get in from the air conditioning and get out of the heat and watch the movie. Maybe I won't notice that I'm restricted, that I'm sitting in the balcony while everybody else is coming in and they're hearing about the film and enticed with the film. And also we have air conditioning, you know, that it's downplayed. So it's kind of like, I'm going to make you think that I'm doing you a favor. You know, and a lot of the fears in my parents' generation around the Johnson administration, you know, it was this new thing called the Head Start program. Well, that sounds very philanthropic and a very good thing to do for the community.
Absolutely.
But those that are discerned is like, well, who are you really doing this for? You know, they're doing some programs in some cities to keep the minority children and the marginalized children away from the other children. So they'll have that. So you would have a primarily white elementary school that there would never even be a mention of Head Start. But in the inner city school would be. Folks could then walk away going, see, we're doing good. We're doing
And they would
good.
feel good, and they're
And
patting
they would
themselves
feel
on the
good,
back.
pat myself on the back, but, you know, didn't actually want it to happen. And so we are now in a place where we can unwind all of that and all of those myths that we hang on to, you know, and like, okay, where did this come from? And a part of, you know, one of the slides that we'll put up on the Facebook page earlier on is a slide that I showed from the slave era with the slave master on the side of the field while all other people doing the work or having their hoes going into the ground doing the work. Fast forward to a photo that was taken 10 years ago in the prison system, and the prison guard is on the horse watching all the black prisoners holding the same hoe, standing in the same field.
By the way, we did show that picture, and when we did your first talk,
Gotcha.
and we broadcasted that on Blended TV, and also we broadcasted that on the CMAC. So we did overlay that so people could see the difference.
Because it's such, you know, to me, that's enlightenment.
Right,
That's
that is
like,
enlightenment.
Oh, this is really what it looks like. And if you look and I so love the new Jim Crow, is it's starting to point out things like, okay, if we tell ourselves just the very simple story The prison is about reform. And so you go to court, you're found guilty of the thing that you did wrong, and you're sent away in order to be reformed.
Yeah,
Okay?
that's what we're told.
Why, when you are out, are you not allowed to vote? As a felon, you cannot vote for the rest of your life.
Right. So
If
you're
your system-
charged for that mistake over and over again,
Right.
again.
And you're supposed to also be told, though, that once you do your time, you paid your dues to society. Well, no, we don't want those folks coming out and voting because they might change the prison system if they could vote because they've been in it. They know that I can put you in a manufacturing job and only pay you 12 cents an hour for doing that manufacturing job, but I can sell it to the outside world and make that product competitive. Now, mind you, you're still never going to see the 12 cents. Because when you go to call your wife or family on that Sunday, that phone call is costing your family $5 a minute because we have worked with a special phone system that is only in the prisons within the United States that is equivalent to what would look like a payday loan company in a sense that nothing that that person makes ever actually ends up in their pocket as income. But we're not noticing out there in the world for folks that live north of Shaw, if you will, that that's what's really going on in the prison system. Because we've bought into this bill of goods, it's about reform. It's about people turning their life around. They even have I know our minister spoke once about doing the prison ministry there. He must have turned lives around.
He must have.
Right. But not even having an idea of the scale that exists and not even understanding how much, here's another good metaphor.
Okay.
Many times you're driving across the United States. Not that this has ever happened to me, but you go a little bit above the speed limit. Suddenly you're pulled over. You get the ticket. You have to go off to the freeway into the little municipality that you happen to be in, and you have to pay cash for that speeding ticket of $200 or $300 right there on the spot, or you don't get to continue on down the road.
Okay.
So that municipality's income depends upon there being so many speeding tickets.
That's a bad thing.
So they will purposely put the speed limit signs at the maximum distance that they can be so that you forget that you went from 70 to 65 so that they can get you. Well, so oftentimes this is how we've set up our systems because there are no longer any federal prisons in the United States that are owned by the federal government.
So we're talking about privatized.
They have been privatized.
Yes.
And don't get shaky, but the only way it's going to change when people can make that comparison, let's privatize Social Security because it's working so well in the prison system. So that you have that idea, well, wait a minute. That means nobody's really watching.
No regulations.
There's no regulation. That's like taking the FDA away from, monitoring the food, that we consume as consumers. So if they take and put the prison systems into the private hands and private parties, then those businesses are only going to do it if they're going to get a good return on their investment. So therefore, we got to have more people coming in all the time.
Not necessarily quality of life or reform at all.
Right, it's not about reform.
Okay.
We'll make it ADA compliant because somebody sued for that, and so, we'll do that. But it's really not set up to be anything about rehabilitation. And then you look at our judicial system to where justice is not blind.
No, it's not.
If justice was blind, the penalty for selling a gram of cocaine would be the same no matter who sold the gram of cocaine. But if you have that opportunity and you happen to be in a family that lives north of Shaw, then, He was just someone who made a bad choice.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be rehabilitated.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be given a second chance. They were just at crazy high school behavior.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a person of color, we've got one more person off the street.
Yeah.
And we've got them into this system. Into this system that even gets into the system where, if you look at the 3 strikes law, a minor offense, like forgetting to call your probation officer at 10 o'clock on a Thursday when you're supposed to, could be the 3rd offense that puts you away for
That
the
is
rest
correct.
of your life.
And it happens all
It
the
is,
time.
because they count on it happening. That's the same intention of putting the speed limit signs at such a distance apart you don't remember what the speed limit is anymore. But we have to call it out for what it is. And I think that when we see something in our lives that looks unjust or doesn't seem quite right, we have to do the discernment to figure out, why is it so?
Reverend Jack, I'm seeing a line of people that know and people that do not know, right?
Right.
So if someone doesn't understand even how the prison system works, but they want to be this person that is saying, hey, I'm helping, I'm trying to do something about it, how can they do something about it if they don't understand what to do to know what to do about that, something they've never experienced before?
Well, one of the things that I try to encourage people to do is trust what comes up before you. So, for example, we just had an experience recently in the country where the children were separated from their parents when their parents came across the border. Well, we got to experience firsthand that a lot of people go, whoa, wait a minute, why, how could that happen? And they suddenly became aware of those are privately owned prisons that are separating those children. And a larger group of people said, I'm not standing for this. I had no idea. So once you know, you've got to then take action on finding out what more you don't know. Because what gets us in trouble with life is what we don't know and what we would pretend not to know.
And we can't be so as to say, well, I'm little bit ignorant, and I should have known. Someone's taking care of it, and I really don't know about that anyway, so I'm going to let someone else handle that.
And then that gets back to education. And it's like, as a parent, the challenge that I would put to any parent, go get your 4th grader's history book, thumb through it, and see who's reflected in it. Who's reflected in this book? Now, does Dr. King, Malcolm X, Thurgood Marshall, and Harriet Tubman get 2 pages?
No.
And somebody else?
Some of them that you named, at least when I was growing up, weren't even in the pages. I remember
Right.
slavery and Martin Luther King, those are the 2 things.
Right.
Harriet Tubman wasn't in there. Malcolm X was considered a renegade, so he wasn't in there either.
Right.
At least when I was growing up.
Right. But even if you look at the Black Panthers, wouldn't it be beneficial to understand how the Black Panthers came into being? Now, a lot of people would go, well, they were militants, they carried guns. Sounds a lot like what some folks right now want to have the right to carry a gun. But if they really did the research just a little bit further, they started the original idea of a Head Start program. The Black Panthers came into being feeding the children.
Yeah. Yep.
That was the difference that they were making in their community. They saw that they had been marginalized. They saw that they had been isolated as a community. And they made the stance, not on my watch. This is not going to happen. We're going to do what we do in order to make a difference and to shift this reality. And so some of the thoughts of the Montessori schools that exist now, some of the thoughts of the more progressive middle schools and programs for children were born out of some of the things that the Black Panthers
Reverend Jack,
were
you're
doing.
just going too deep for people. I don't think they can take all this.
But it's
they can't take it all.
I want you to go to something that we never had
Right.
when I was a young person. Dr. Google.
I didn't have that.
Yeah.
I didn't have that.
Now we have Dr. Google. And it was like one of the things that annoys me with the millennials that in my life, if I start to tell the story, like if I would have started to even say this thing about the Black Panthers, the millennials in my life would be going, well, no, actually, it was in 1964, and it was in East Oakland, and it started here. And I would be fact-checked. And it's like, what I love about the millennials is they're fact-checking what they hear, just because they're curious at a deeper level. Now, we've gotten complacent to where we don't fact-check. In fact, when we get back to our tribes, if our tribe of Fox News told us that this is the way that it is,
then that's the way it is.
Believe it. If MSNBC tells us the way that it is,
then that's the way it is.
We believe it. You know, but we're not even in that point of let
So
me
we've
see
reversed
the other.
it. We're actually the lazy ones.
We-
The millennials are doing their thing.
Yes,
Actually,
yes.
I'm considered one of the millennials because I do my research.
Right,
I'll
right,
go check it
right,
out. But for the
right.
most part, all of us are just
But
listening
you
to the news.
raised millennials.
Yes.
So therefore,
Yes.
you were the demonstration. What my parents did is my parents got 4 newspapers delivered to our home. The Indianapolis Star, the Indianapolis News, the Muncie Star, and the Muncie Press. The morning papers were the Democratic papers. The evening papers were the Republican papers. They read both and then discerned. So they were Union Democrats that would vote for Eisenhower. You know, because they would make that bridge of, you know, we're honoring the military and he brings these values, but they did that discernment process. So they did with the technology that they had what our millennials are doing today. Who skipped was in the middle.
It's just changed. You're right.
Right.
Because I do remember my parents having the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Jose Mercury News, another African American newspaper, and then also the New York Times. And they're probably doing the same thing. I'm like,
Right.
God, why don't they just read from one? And at that time, I was like, what's wrong with them? They're reading like from 4 papers. They're all saying the same thing. But they really weren't saying the same thing.
Right.
But it felt like it. They were saying the same thing.
And now one of the things that we have lost in this country is, like if in the state of California, there is no longer a privately owned newspaper in the state of California. They're all owned by conglomerates.
Yes, they are.
And again, at first pass, it's economics. You know, we can have one giant newsroom and feed the San Jose Mercury News, the Oakland Tribune, the Contra Costa Times, all have the same newsroom. But in the day, the Oakland Tribune would not necessarily be publishing the same spin on a story that the San Jose Mercury News would have been spending on that story.
That's correct.
But today, once you get past the cover page or the first page,
It's pretty much the same.
what paper am I looking at?
Yeah,
You know,
because even
the
if you're looking
photos
at the
are same
Merced
thing.
Sun-Star here, you're still looking at the Fresno Bee or the Sacramento Bee, pretty much the same.
When I I was a broadcast major in college, and I loved the idea of radio and being on radio, until it came to where Westwood and Clear Channel bought all of those small independent radio stations across the channel, and they would send out a mandate at 10:15 a.m. This is the song
That's
that
what
we'll
you're
be
gonna
playing.
play.
And so that everywhere, everybody was getting the same message. And so that whole, nobody told anybody that that's what was happening.
But isn't that kind of our fault? Because as a community, we should have been supporting that little mom and pop station that I'm getting my news and information about local Marie's 100th birthday party.
Right.
We should be, shame on us.
Right.
For not supporting the little guy.
Right.
And then we just said, well, I'm just going to turn on my CNN because it's cable, and I like to pay a bigger bill anyway. So I'm just going to pay my cable bill. So I can watch
look
my
at
CNN,
where-
I can watch my Fox, I can watch my MSNBC. I'm just saying, that's our fault.
We did it for economics.
Did we? Because
did it.
we're
Look,
spending so much
because,
money on
you know,
cable.
Who is the largest retailer in the United States?
But Walmart
Yes. And what did Walmart do?
knocked out the little guy.
And knocked out the little guy. The mom
Made
and
those
pop
prices
all
very
went out of
small.
business.
Yes.
But it was marketed in such a way that unless you had the Nike watch, your town didn't feel like it had arrived until there was a Walmart on the side of town. regardless of whether somebody said to you, it's going to kill Bill's hardware store downtown. It's going to put Betty's, muffin shop out of business. And it's like, yeah, but we got to have a Walmart.
Because it's cheaper prices.
It's just cheaper prices. And we don't even acknowledge how did those prices get to be cheaper.
No one's talking about the sweatshops of some of these things that are being created.
How many people, it's like I remember, standing in a store and hearing a young man say to his mom, this is, what Bangladeshi, what brand is that? And it was that the item was made in
Bangladesh, yes.
And it was like, but the parent, because, those chapters are not taught in world history anymore, didn't have an idea where Bangladesh was.
We've just barely hitting the tip of imagining justice. Those of you who are turning, there's so much more. We're already almost at the hour. By the last 10 minutes, we want to make sure we get questions from people that are in the audience, and we'll also look on Facebook to see if any of you have questions. But we'll go to a brief break that gives you a chance to either put the questions on Facebook, or I know there's some folks here, because I know that there's one person I know that always has questions, and I want to make sure I give her that opportunity. But you are watching Imagining Justice with myself, Julia Dudley Najieb, and Reverend Jack Elliott. We will be right back.
Can I recycle this?
When it comes to recycling, don't get hosed. Put broken garden hoses in the gray trash cart. For more recycling do's and don'ts, ask us on our Instagram or visit keepfresnoclean.com.
This is important news for people who have been exposed to the weed killer Roundup in commercial settings and later developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. According to the World Health Organization's research on cancer, the active ingredient in the weed killer Roundup, glyphosate, can cause cancers such as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. If you or a loved one were exposed to Roundup in a commercial setting such as farming, landscaping, or golf course maintenance, and then developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you could be eligible for a cash award and medical expenses. If you or a loved one were exposed to the weed killer Roundup and were then diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, call the law offices of Davis and Crump right now to see if you are eligible for a cash award and medical expenses. Our first consultation is free, and we don't get paid unless you get paid. Call now. Operators are standing by.
Attention all timeshare owners. Were you a victim of a high-pressure or dishonest timeshare sales agent? Were you misled and confused by what you were buying? Did the timeshare fail to deliver what you were promised? Do you feel that you overpaid and just won out? If you answered yes to any of these questions, we can help. We're Timeshare Compliance, and every day we help hundreds of timeshare victims protect their rights, and we can help you too. Our team can legally terminate your timeshare agreement, ending the payments forever, saving you thousands. But you must act now. Call now for a free consultation. With one simple call, the professionals at Timeshare Compliance can legally terminate your timeshare agreement and help end your financial suffering. You could save thousands. So call now before another payment is due. Timeshare Compliance is A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau. Don't wait.
Call 800-455-0830. 800-455-0830.
Attention all timeshare owners. Were you a victim of a high-pressure or dishonest timeshare sales agent? Were you misled and confused by what you were buying? Did the timeshare fail to deliver what you were promised? Do you feel that you overpaid and just won out? If you answered yes to any of these questions, we can help. We're Timeshare Compliance, and every day we help hundreds of timeshare victims protect their rights, and we can help you too. Our team can legally terminate your timeshare agreement, ending the payments forever, saving you thousands. But you must act now. Call now for a free consultation. With one simple call, the professionals at Timeshare Compliance can legally terminate your timeshare agreement and help end your financial suffering. You could save thousands. So call now before another payment is due. Timeshare Compliance is A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau. Don't wait. Call 800-455-0830. 800-455-0830.
What cart does this go in?
We know changing diapers stinks, Andy, but what you do with that doo-doo is throw it in the gray cart. To learn more about recycling do's and don'ts, ask us on our Instagram or visit keepfresnoclean.com.
Welcome back to Imagining Justice. Myself, Julia Dudley Najieb, along with Reverend Jack Elliott, and we've been having a discussion. This is all preliminary. We haven't even gotten to the deep stuff out of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And we said we would allow this time for questions. You heard the question at the break. Are you shocked about the question? Are you shocked about the results of the question? Should I say what the question is? I'm flabbergasted.
The question is, and how our crack research team went into action during the commercial break.
So the question that was asked at break had to do with is Walmart, any of these major chains are part of this prison industrial complex, and they are because they are benefiting from it by getting goods and services they're actually purchasing from it. So even if they're not participating in it, meaning having their laborers and workers that are specifically working on items for Walmart, Walmart is indeed purchasing produce from prison farms. And we are told that at these prison farms, they don't get enough food or water, and they're out in the sun all day, so they're not even getting adequate basic needs for to be a human.
And the guys, the magic word there was the third party. If you think about what is just in the news recently, third party can be anything from the offshore banking, to how it's financed. Third party gives me an LLC that I can hide behind so that you don't necessarily know that it's me doing it. So they are participating in it, and we have to really look at the consciousness behind what are we supporting when we pretend not to know what's happening.
And then when you know the information, what are you going to do with it? Are you still going to shop at Walmart?
Right. Or are you going to get a group of like-minded people to do a little protest out in front of Walmart, just to really say, hey, why is this happening? No, this really can't happen on my watch and not in my town. I saw one of those protests happen effectively many years ago when I lived in Tracy, California. One of the things that there was a gentleman that was fired for was taking the produce that had expired, and instead of putting it into the trash dumpsters, took it to the local food bank.
Fired for bringing it to the food bank?
Yes.
Okay, because they wanted to resell that food?
No,
Why?
because they had an agreement with the waste management people that there would be so much disposable trash in the trash bins, but since he took most of it away to the food bank,
Wow, okay.
then this third-party contract is not being fulfilled. But there was also the policy that was theft. And he was fired for stealing food.
Even though it was going to a food bank where people need food, and not need, but are given food. I just want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly.
Yes.
Okay.
And when that happened, and the local people, because again, in a small town that exists in America, is like, what do you mean you fired Joe? Type of thing. And people came, and what did he do? He fed the hungry. With food that you had thrown away. And again, because Walmart has the attorneys that Walmart has,
so nobody could stand up for him, really.
Right. No one, in the company could stand up for him. And they actually were able to do it because, if the bread expires at midnight tonight and you take it at midnight tonight to the food bank and give it to tomorrow, then somebody might get sick on that food tomorrow, for eating expired food. Now, a part of that movement has turned around, and some powerful restaurants in some major cities have now done the due diligence with public health systems to say, how do we consciously dispose of food so that it immediately goes to a food bank so that its life cycle can continue and it can make a difference. But a part of needing to understand that we have to do that came out of things like the arrest of the gentleman who was just giving food away.
Okay, you see what I mean? We're only on part one, folks, and we've barely touched the surface. And I just want to let you know, Whole Foods also uses Colorado prisoners, and AT&T has been using prisoners in their call center since 1993. Reverend Jack, I'm telling you, we have a lot to explore.
Yep.
And how can people RSVP? Where do we go to RSVP? And we'll add it to the screen.
What we want to do, we would love to have you come and be a part of the studio audience. And what we would like for you to do is just send me a note at revjack@centralvalleycsl.org. That's REVJACK at centralvalleycsl.org. And let us know that you watched today's program, that you would like to be in our audience, and tell somebody about it. Share the video, share your feedback about it so that we can really get in. Because part of my intention is to build up towards Election Day, and that you're a little bit more conscious about how you're going to vote on Election Day based on what you've learned in the 4 weeks up to Election Day.
That sounds simple enough. Now we just need folks to tune in, and we appreciate you watching this edition of Imagining Justice. We've got 5 more weeks for you to be informed. Let people know what's happening. CentralValleyCSL.org, or you can also go to the On Me channel. If you go to the onmetv.com, you're able to watch this program tonight, and we will be rebroadcasting this on the On Me network, as well as Central Valley CSL, as well as on Blended TV and other networks, and CMAX. So we know that you shall be engaged, and we really would like your input. We thank you for watching this edition. Thank you, Reverend Jack, for coming in the studio. I know it's late. Thank you, audience members. So grateful. And we will see you next week.